Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson on the trachea. In the previous lesson, we talked about the upper respiratory tract, which included the nasopharynx and larynx. We discussed how the respiratory tract, microscopically, has four layers: the mucosa, submucosa, smooth muscle and cartilage layer, and adventitia. We then looked at the microscopic structure of the upper respiratory tract in detail. In this lesson, we're talking about the trachea, which is now a part of the lower respiratory tract. The trachea, which is commonly called the windpipe, is a hollow muscular tube that is placed right in front of the esophagus. The esophagus, as a quick side note, is the tube through which the food passes to get to the stomach. The trachea, on the other hand, is the tube through which the air we breathe passes to reach our lungs. And that's why it's called the windpipe, since it's a conducting pipe for air. Now, if you look at the trachea from the front, you'll see that it looks like a stack of rings. That's because of these C-shaped rings of cartilage right here, positioned in a regular arrangement. Now, these aren't just for show. The C-shaped rings of cartilage help keep the trachea patent at all times and prevent it from collapsing inwards. Now, the trachea doesn't just have the cartilage layer. It has all the four layers that we've talked about. Let's now take a look at this layer right here, the mucosa. The mucosa is the layer that's closest to the lumen of the trachea, which is the hollow part of the tube, the inside. And the epithelium of the trachea is one that you're already familiar with, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. If you remember, this is the same epithelium we talked about in the lesson on the upper respiratory tract. Now, these cells here are called goblet cells, another familiar structure from the last lesson. If you'll recall, these cells produce mucus, and just like in the upper respiratory tract, the mucus here is also responsible for trapping any foreign particles that made it all the way to the trachea. The mucosa rests on something called the basement membrane, which separates it from the next layer, the submucosa. As you can see here, the submucosa sits just beneath the basement membrane, and it has a lot of loose connective tissue or supporting tissue in it. Embedded in this connective tissue, you'll find blood vessels and mucus glands. The blood flowing through these blood vessels warms up the air as it passes through the trachea. Since the blood is warmer than air, the heat from the blood will warm that air up. These mucus glands also produce mucus, much like the goblet cells. Now, in case the foreign particles trapped by the mucus are too large to be brushed upwards, it can then irritate the lining of the trachea and stimulate both the goblet cells and the mucus glands in the submucosa to increase mucus production. The mucus, as we've already seen, functions to trap those foreign particles and helps keep the trachea both moist and lubricated.
Quick pause. If you're finding value in this explanation, there's so much more to discover at Alt Academy, where we break down every A-level concept with the same clarity. Now back to the video lesson.
Just like we learned in our previous lesson, this prevents desiccation or drying out, and also serves to reduce friction between the foreign particle and the mucosal surface, thereby preventing damage. And again, just like we learned in our last lesson, the cilia present on the epithelium of the mucosa will push this mucus up towards the pharynx. Below the submucosa is the cartilage and smooth muscle layer. As we already mentioned, the cartilage in the trachea is arranged in a very characteristic C-shaped structure at the front of the tube, which serves to support the tube. These C-shaped rings are what give the trachea its ring-like appearance and are what you will use to identify the trachea when you're shown a photomicrograph. Besides the rings, there's also some smooth muscle at the back of the trachea that supports it from there. The placement of the cartilage rings at the front of the trachea is important. Remember, the esophagus passes right behind the trachea, And what did we already say about the esophagus? That's the tube through which food passes to get to the stomach. Now, if the cartilage was also at the back of the trachea, it could potentially obstruct the passage of food through the esophagus. When you swallow a morsel of food, the esophagus distends to accommodate that. With the relatively stiff cartilage at the back of the trachea, which is right in front of the esophagus, there wouldn't be enough room for the esophagus to distend, and swallowing would become quite uncomfortable, or in the worst case, the morsel of food could get stuck. So the strategic placement of the C-shaped cartilage in the front prevents it from collapsing inwards, but also prevents the trachea from compressing other surrounding structures. Alright, so that covers the structure of the trachea, which carries air from the nasopharynx to the lungs. As the trachea continues downwards, it divides into two smaller tubes called bronchi. This is the right main bronchus, and this one is the left main bronchus. Each of these bronchi take air from the trachea to their respective lungs, where they further divide into even smaller bronchioles and finally into tiny little air sacs called alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. We'll talk more about those structures in our next lesson. Okay, now let's summarize what we did. In this lesson, we covered the trachea and its 4 layers. We started with the mucosa, which has a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium and also has goblet cells that produce mucus. Then we looked at the submucosa, which contains loose connective tissue with blood vessels and mucus glands. We learned that the blood vessels here warm the air in the trachea and the mucus gland produce mucus. After that, we looked at the smooth muscle and cartilage layer and learned about how the C-shaped cartilage, which can be used to identify the trachea, supports it from the front and prevents its inward collapse, while smooth muscle supports it from the back so that swallowing is unimpeded. Finally, we concluded by talking about how the trachea further divides into smaller structures called bronchi, which we'll cover in more detail in our next lesson. I hope you find this lesson helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey there! If you found this A-level biology lesson helpful, why don't you head over to altacademy.org and sign up for our full A-level biology course. In addition to biology, you could sign up for physics, chemistry, math, or 4 other A-level subjects. Thousands of students have already taken the leap. What are you waiting for? See you there.